Continuing and probably concluding Pompey from Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. Pompey, sailing by the city of Amphipolis, crossed over from thence to Mytilene with a design to take in Cornelia and his son. And as soon as he arrived at the port in that island, he dispatched a messenger into the city with news very different from Cornelia's expectation, for she, by all former messages and letters sent to please her, had been put in hopes that the war was ended at Dyrrhachium, and that there was nothing more remaining for Pompey but the pursuit of Caesar. The messenger, finding her in the same hope still, was not able to salute or speak to her, but, declaring the greatness of her misfortune by his tears rather than his words, desired her to make haste if she would see Pompey with one ship only, and that not of his own. The young lady, hearing this, fell down in a swoon, and continued a long time senseless and speechless, and when with some trouble she was brought to her senses again, being conscious to herself that this was no time for lamentation and tears, she started up and ran through the city toward the seaside, where Pompey, beating and embracing her, as she sank down, supported by his arms, "This, sir," she exclaimed, "is the effect of my fortune, not of yours, that I see you thus reduced to one poor vessel, who before your marriage with Cornelia were wont to sail in these seas with a fleet of 500 ships. Why, therefore, should you come to see me, or why not rather have left to her evil genius, one who has brought upon you her own ill fortune? How happy a woman had I been if I had breathed out my last before the news came from Parthia of the death of Publius, the husband of my youth, and how prudent if I had followed his destiny as I designed. But I was reserved for a greater mischief, even the ruin of Pompey the Great." Thus, they say, Cornelia spoke to him, and this was Pompey's reply: "You have had, Cornelia, but one season of a better fortune, which it may be gave you unfounded hopes. By attending me a longer time than is usual, it behooves us, who are mortals born, to endure these events and try fortune yet again. Neither is it any less possible to recover our former state than it was to fall from that into this." Thereupon Cornelia sent for her servants and baggage out of the city. The city also of Mytilene came out to salute and invite Pompey into the city, but he refused, advising them to be obedient to the conqueror and fear not, for that Caesar was a man of great goodness and clemency. Then, turning to Chrysippas, the philosopher, who came among the rest of the city to visit him, he began to find some fault, and briefly argued with him upon providence, but Chrysippas modestly declined the dispute, putting him in better hopes only, lest by opposing he might seem too austere or unseasonable, for he might have put Pompey a question in his turn in defense of Providence, and might have demonstrated the necessity that there was the Commonwealth should be turned into a monarchy, how became their ill government in the state, and could have asked, "How, O Pompey, and by what token or assurance can we ascertain that if the victory had been yours, you would have used your fortune better than Caesar? You must leave the divine power to act as we find it due." Now, we can't blame the decisions of people and their effects per se on, the divine, but the divine will make sure that everybody has the opportunities, and only those opportunities which they can believe and do what's right. And not only that, it definitely seems that it's beyond any expectation or reason of anybody at the time that certain people are chosen for certain fates because they really were the best for that. Because if Caesar made some wrong decisions, perhaps he could have made right decisions. And perhaps if someone else was put in his position, then they wouldn't have been able to make some of the right decisions, right? Pompey, having taken his wife and friends aboard, set sail, making no port or touching anywhere, but he was necessitated to take in provisions or fresh water. The first city he entered was Atalia in Pamphylia, and whilst he was there came some galleys thither to him out of Cilicia, together with a small body of soldiers, and he had almost 60 senators with him again. And hearing that his navy was safe too, and that Cato had rallied a considerable body of soldiers after their overthrow, and was crossing with them over into Africa, he began to complain and blame himself to his friends that he had allowed himself to be driven into engaging by land without making use of his other forces, in which he was irresistibly the stronger, and had not kept near enough to his fleet, that failing by land, he might have reinforced him from the sea, and would have been again at the head of a power quite sufficient to encounter the enemy on equal terms. And in truth, neither did Pompey during all the war commit a greater oversight, nor Caesar use a more subtle stratagem than in drawing the fight so far off from the naval forces. Well, that's one of your goals in war, right? To keep the danger. You head out to battle because the danger is coming here. Now, hopefully that's your intentions, not, there's a battle over there, I can get something. Obviously, you know that there's possible glory and wealth and stuff to come from war, but just as something that's going on while I'm recording this, it's like one of the top producers of wheat in the world or something like this. Is being overtaken. And as it now was, however, since he must come to some decision and try some plan within his present ability, he dispatched his agents to the neighboring cities, and himself sailed about in person to others, requiring their aid in money and men for his ships. But fearing lest the rapid approach of the enemy might cut off his preparations, he began to consider what place would yield him the safest refuge, and returned at present. Consultation was held, and it was generally agreed that no province of the Romans was secure enough. As for foreign kingdoms, he himself was of the opinion that Parthia would be the fittest to receive and defend them in their present weakness, and best able to furnish them with new means, and send them out again with large forces. Others of the council were for going into Africa and to King Juba, but Theophanes, the Lesbian, from the Isle of Lesbos, it's not the same thing that we say when we say lesbian now, right? Thought it madness to leave Egypt, that was but at a distance of 3 days' sailing, and make no use of Ptolemy, who was still a boy, and was highly indebted to Pompey for the friendship and favor he had shown to his father, only to put himself under the Parthian and trust the most treacherous nation in the world, and rather than make any trial of the clemency of a Roman and his own near connection, to whom, if he would but yield to be second, he might be the first and chief over all the rest, and go and place himself at the mercy of Arsaces, which even Crassus had not submitted to while alive, and were to expose his young wife of the family of the Scipios among a barbarous people, who govern by their lusts, and measure their greatness by their power to commit affronts and insolences, from whom, though she suffered no dishonor, yet it might be thought she did, being in the hands of those who had power to do it. This argument alone, they say, was persuasive enough to divert his course, that was designed toward Euphrates, if it were so indeed that any counsel of Pompey's, and not some superior power, made him take this other way. As soon, therefore, as it was resolved upon that he should fly into Italy, setting sail from Cyprus in a galley of Seleucia, together with Cornelia, while the rest of his company sailed along with him, some in ships of war and others in merchant vessels, he passed over the sea without danger. But on hearing that King Ptolemy was posted with his army at the city of Pelusium, making war against his sister, he steered his course that way, and sent a messenger before to acquaint the king with his arrival and to crave his protection. But Dilemma himself was quite young, and therefore Pothinus, who had the principal administration of affairs, called a council of the chief men, those being the greatest, whom he pleased to make so, and command them every man to deliver his opinion touching the reception of Pompey. Well, if it was Greek, you'd say Pompeu, but I don't remember the spelling in Greek. But it was indeed a miserable thing that the fate of the great Pompey should be left to the determinations of Pothinus, the eunuch, Theodotus of Cois, the paid rhetoric master, kind of like those climate change scientists versus the climatologist and geologist, right? There's plenty of other examples, but not that I don't believe in that the pollution's doing something, but, and Achilles, the Egyptian. For these, among the chamberlains and menial domestics that made up the rest of the council, were the chief and leading man, Pompey, who thought it dishonorable for him to owe his safety to Caesar, riding at anchor at a distance from the shore, and forced to wait the sentence of this tribunal. It seems they were so far different in their opinions that some were for sending the man away, and others again for inviting and receiving him. But Theodotus, to show his cleverness and the cogency of his rhetoric, undertook to demonstrate that neither the one nor the other was safe in that juncture of affairs, for if they entertained him, they would be sure to make Caesar their enemy and Pompey their master, or if they dismissed him, they might render themselves hereafter obnoxious to Pompey for that inhospitable expulsion, and to Caesar for the escape, so that the most expedient course would be to send for him and take away his life, for by that means they would ingratiate themselves with the one and have no reason to fear the other, adding, it is related with a smile, that a dead man cannot bite. This advice being approved of, they committed the execution of it to Achilles. He, therefore, taking with him as his accomplices one Septimius, a man that had formerly held a command under Pompey, and Salvius, another centurion with 3 or 4 attendants, made up towards Pompey's galley. In the meantime, all the chiefest of those who accompanied Pompey in this voyage were come into his ship to learn the event of their embassy, but when they saw the manner of their reception, that in appearance it was neither princely nor honorable, nor indeed in any way answerable to the hopes of Theophanes, or their expectation, for there came but a few men in a fisherman's boat to meet them, they began to suspect the meanness of their entertainment, and gave warning to Pompey that he should row back his galley whilst he was out of their reach, and make for the sea. By this time the Egyptian boat drew near, and Septimius, standing at first, saluted Pompey in the Latin tongue by the title of Imperator. Then Achilles, saluting him in the Greek language, desired him to come aboard his vessel, telling him that the sea was very shallow towards the shore, and that a galley of that burden could not avoid striking up the sands. At the same time they saw several of the king's galleys getting their men on board, and all the shore covered with soldiers, so that even if they changed their minds, it seemed impossible for them to escape, and besides their distrust would have given the assassins a pretense for their cruelty. Pompey, therefore, taking his leave of Cornelia, who was already lamenting his death before it came, bade 2 centurions, with Philip, one of his freedmen, and a slave called Scuthus, to go on board the boat before him, and as some of the crew with Achilles were reaching out their hands to help him, he turned about towards his wife and son, and repeated those iambics of Sophocles: he that once enters at a tyrant's door becomes a slave, though he were free before. Those were the last words he spoke to his friends, so he went aboard, observing presently that, notwithstanding there was a considerable distance betwixt his galley and the shore, yet none of the company addressed any words of friendliness or welcome to him all the way. He looked earnestly upon Septimius and said, I am not mistaken, surely, in believing you to have been formerly my fellow soldier. But he only nodded with his head, making no reply at all, nor showing any other courtesy, since before they continued silent, Pompey took a little book in his hand, in which was written out an address in Greek which he intended to make to King Ptolemy, and began to read it. When they drew near the shore, Cornelia, together with the rest of his friends in the galley, was very impatient to see the event, and began to take courage at last, when she saw several of the royal escort coming to meet him, apparently to give him a more honorable reception. In the meantime, as Pompey took Philip by the hand to rise up more easily, Septimius, I'm not used to saying some of these combinations right, first stabbed him from behind with his sword, and after him likewise Salvius and Achilles drew out their swords, and he, therefore, taking up his gown with both hands, drew it over his face, and neither saying or doing anything unworthy of himself, only groaning a little, enduring the wounds they gave him, and so ended his life in the 59th year of his age, the very next day after the day of his birth. So the 59th year of his age. Are they saying he was 58? Or are they saying he just turned 59? As the 59th year is when you're 58. I'm nowhere near 58, but yeah, if I was, it doesn't matter really. Cornelia, with her company from the galley, seizing him, murdered, gave such a cry that it was heard on the shore, and weighing anchor with all speed, they hoisted sail and fled. A strong breeze from the shore assisted their flight into the open sea, so that the Egyptians, though desirous to overtake them, desisted from the pursuit. But they cut off Pompey's head and threw the rest of his body overboard, leaving it naked upon the shore to be viewed by any that had the courtesy to see so sad a spectacle. Philip stayed by and watched till they had glutted their eyes in viewing it, and then washing it with sea water, having nothing else, he wrapped it in a shirt of his own for a winding sheet. Then, seeking up and down about the sands, at last he found some rotten planks of a little fisher boat, not much, but yet enough to make up a funeral pile for a naked body, and that not quite entire, as Philip was busy in gathering and putting these old planks together. An old Roman citizen, who in his youth had served in the wars under Pompey, came up to him and demanded who he was, that was preparing the funeral of Pompey the Great, and Philip, making answer that he was his freedman. Nay, then, said he, you shall not have this honor alone. Let even me too, I pray you, have my share in such a pious office, that I may not altogether repent me of this pilgrimage in a strange land, but, in compensation of many misfortunes, may obtain this happiness at last, even with mine own hands, to touch the body of Pompey and do the last duties to the greatest general among the Romans. And in this manner were the obsequies of Pompey performed. The next day, Lucius and Tullus, not knowing what had passed, came sailing from Cyprus along the shore of that coast, and seeing a funeral pile, and Philip, standing by, exclaimed, before he was yet seen by anyone, who is this that has found his end here? Adding after a short pause with a sigh, possibly even thou, Pompeius Magnus, and so going ashore, he was presently apprehended and slain. This was the end of Pompey. Not long after, Caesar arrived in the country that was polluted with this foul act, and when one of the Egyptians was sent to present him with Pompey's head, he turned away from him with abhorrence, as from a murderer, and on receiving his seal, on which was engraved a lion holding a sword in his paw, he burst into tears. Achilles and Pothinus he put to death, and King Ptolemy himself, being overthrown in battle upon the banks of the Nile, fled away and was never heard of afterwards. Theodotus, the rhetorician, flying out of Egypt, escaped the hands of Caesar's justice, but lived a vagabond in banishment, wandering up and down, despised and hated of all men, till at last Marcus Brutus, after he had killed Caesar, finding him in his province of Asia, put him to death with every kind of ignominy. The ashes of Pompey were carried to his wife, Cornelia, who deposited them at his country house near Alba. One of the reasons why people cremate is to free the soul, help the process of that sort of thing. Of course, occasionally, just like the people who do the embalming and sucks the fluid out, sometimes somebody's killed by the process. If you don't do that, they can, survive the preparation stages for the burial. But if you do that stuff, then, not that we're the body, it doesn't matter how preserved we are. That doesn't determine our afterlife, I wouldn't think. That doesn't